You're listening to the Deltek Podcast, the show for leaders in project-driven industries where the stakes are always high and the margin for error is zero. In every episode, we bring you the data, the experts, and the insights that help you lead with speed, clarity, and control. Now, let's get into it.
Welcome, and thanks for joining us for the Deltek Podcast today. I'm Michael Greenman. I'm Senior Product Marketing Manager at Deltek. And today I'm very, very pleased to be joined by my colleague and subject matter expert, Padma Raghunathan. In this episode, we're talking about Golden Dome and how the conversation has shifted from getting on contract to actually competing and delivering. So with awards underway and task order activity picking up, this is quickly becoming a discussion about execution, which we talk a lot about and know a decent amount. And Padma is going to talk about how she's well positioned to give you some advice on that. And with that, Padma, before we dive in, I want to let you introduce yourself to the audience here today and give everyone a quick sense of your role and perspective when it comes to government contracting.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael. And hi, everyone. I'm Padma Raghunathan. I'm also a Senior Product Marketing Manager at Deltek and special focus on GovCon and aerospace and defense. I have spent a little more than 15 years now in the industry in some capacity. And it's been really interesting to see how the defense industrial base has actually evolved in more than a decade. And I think we are definitely in exciting times and interesting times.
What we're talking about today is this Golden Dome opportunity, kind of high level, $1 trillion, graphics and stuff. And, I think we're going to kind of hone down into the SHIELD initiative, which is actual real money, real task orders, 150 billion, getting us some highlights here of the program and let you take it from there. 10-year IDIQ contract managed by the Missile Defense Agency, or MD. There's 2 award tranches that are issued. There's 2,400 plus approved vendors across 19 plus mission areas. Task order competition is live right now. So the big budget backdrop here is, the FY27 defense request is over $1 trillion, first $1 trillion budget in the history, I think, of the government, definitely for defense. It's a 9% increase over last year. Potential for 1.4 trillion in money. Air Force is up, Navy's up. Defense agencies, including the MDA, have lots and lots of money to spend. So with Golden Dome no longer being on the horizon and that Department of War spending like there's no tomorrow, awards are in and task order competition's underway. What does the competitive landscape actually look like right now, heading into the second half of 2026?
Yeah. And, you rattled out some numbers over there, Michael. Those are some big numbers. I don't think, the industry has seen such that scale in a very long time. And, when contractors hear numbers like $151 billion or $1 trillion in defense budget, it's for folks who are following the industry closely. We are looking at it from budgets and policies, from that lens. But contractors are not looking at it like, what's that budget table looking like, or what does that policy document say? No, they're thinking about what it means for their business. They're thinking about growth. They're thinking about where the opportunities are for them. They're thinking, whether they're positioned to compete, whether they have a role to play in this. What is clearly becoming, some major defense priorities over here. So, since we both have been closely involved, with Deltek Clarity, which is our annual benchmarking study, one of the things that came out of this exercise was that the optimism is real. And why not, right? There's so much going on, and there's a lot of funding, and there's so much coming down the pipe. So I think close to 60% of our government contractors have indicated that they expect, their revenue to increase over the next 12 months, which totally makes sense, given what the industry is doing, what the government is doing. So the optimism aligns with what the reality is. But I think the biggest thing that's changed is that Golden Dome is no longer hypothetical, right? It's not just another headline or an announcement. I think everyone, for a while, they were asking, what is Golden Dome? How do I position? I think we're way past that stage now. Like, awards have been made, task orders have been awarded, and we're starting to see what actually matters in practice. The other thing that I point out is that contractors shouldn't think that this is just one single opportunity. A shield is obviously that headline vehicle, and it gets most of the attention. But what we're really seeing is a broader shift in the defense investment priority. So there are multiple pathways, multiple mission areas, and a sustained focus on missile defense, space, technologies, AI, and so on and so forth. So what that means is the conversation is evolving. But what we're also increasingly seeing is that access alone is not enough, right? You have to, access gets you in the game, but readiness determines what happens next and how the competitive landscape is getting drawn. A lot of firms are asking, how do I get in? That's one question. The second question is, am I prepared to compete and execute once I get in?
Sounds like a lot's going on. Is the competition already over? I mean, are we declaring winners, or can people still
There's more
play?
coming. Exactly. There's more coming, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, very cool. Well, so I think that kind of pivots us to our next part here about competing and winning, right? So, okay, the table's set. There's money out there to be had.
Yeah.
The documentation's out there. There's contract vehicles. There's task orders. There's all the things, and all the teams are joining together. So, before a firm can even get to the starting line, they have a couple of hurdles to pass, right? One of them is my favorite subject, CMMC Level 2 required. Even if you get past the first gate, which is all the prime contractors that say, we're not even going to talk to you unless you have this. But that is a very, very clear requirement of this contracting opportunity. But then also defensible pricing. That's another part here that you're going to get into, and I think a lot of people are curious about. So talking about CMMC a little bit, and I'll segue back to the non-nerdy stuff related to contracts here. But CMMC seems more like an entry gate. In our clarity study that you mentioned before, that's out now, CMMC is the entry gate. It's not a future project. It's a competitive differentiator. It flows down, right, primes to subs. And speaking of clarity, 59% expect CMMC to apply to them in 2026, and of that group, actually, like over 3/4 in the data, they say that they're planning for a CMMC third-party assessment this year. So there's a big separation here amongst the have and have-nots when it comes to cyber compliance readiness. But there's a lot of these contractors that are still behind, and it's a concern for primes and, of course, DoD, DoW themselves. So it's a bit of a competitive advantage, but even more so, it seems like it's the entry ticket. So with all that backdrop, what are the winning firms doing differently, in addition to these compliance regimes?
Yeah. So, and Michael, I'm always happy to nerd it out with you. So just to let you know. So, but but when we talk about what are winning firms doing differently, what we're seeing is that firms who are winning tend to be incredibly disciplined, right? That just stands out, actually. Like, they're very selective about what they pursue. They understand, where they have a legitimate right to win, and they're realistic about their capabilities, and they're very, very intentional about how they build their teams. And I think that's becoming even more important as programs become more complex, and compliance expectations, especially around CMMC, they continue to expand across the supply chain. It's not just limited to the primes. It's not just limited to just some key, the tier ones. No, it is flowing down across the supply chain. And the other thing they do really well is build really strong teams. When I say strong teams, I'm not just talking about technical capability. I'm talking about operational maturity, because at the end of the day, you're not just building like just a small team. Like, you're building that full execution team, so that team has to be like special capabilities, really, like, what would you say, like the Division 1 athlete, I don't know if that's the
Like
correct.
everybody that needs to be a D1 athlete to play on the team. In
Right,
one form or
right.
another, 6'2", 220 pounds, 8% body mass.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. And when I think about what a strong partner looks like, again, just referencing to the clarity data, it's actually pretty telling, right? So organizations are looking for partners that are obviously cost competitive. Like, that's a given, right? But they have to also have proven past performance, which is also a given. But things are slowly shifting from that, right? You have to also prove, or you have to demonstrate financial stability. You should be able to comply, with FAR and DFARS requirements. you should also be able to integrate effectively into the broader operating environment, right? And increasingly, they're also looking at things like cloud readiness and demonstrated CMMC preparedness, which you alluded to, right? So to me, that's a shift. A few years ago, the conversation may have started and ended with just technical capability. Like, do you know what you have to do here to win this or to execute this? Today, organizations are being consistently and constantly, asked, can this company actually execute? Like, can they integrate into our environment? Can they support the compliance and reporting requirements that comes with the work? Now, these questions at a surface level may seem very simple and basic, but if the answer is no, then you're not really the partner. You no longer are the teammate, because now you're just not someone who is disqualified. You are actually a risk, and that's why you're disqualified, right? So what's interesting is that while compliance expectations continue to rise, and this was something very interesting that we found in our findings as well, like less than 10% of contractors say that they're fully confident in their ability to verify subcontractor compliance. So that means that's like scratching the surface, right? Like you have like less than 10% saying that, yeah, I can confidently check and verify, right? So, and more than a third actually say that they're relying on manual reviews and like workarounds to manage this relationship. Like that's scary.
Yeah, when you
right?
find out, it might be too late.
Exactly. And that's a challenge because primes are increasingly accountable not only for their own performance, but they're also accountable for the performance and compliance posture of that entire team that they're putting together, right? And I think we're going to see even more focus on this as domestic sourcing requirements, right? Supply chain resilience, cybersecurity requirements, and even your flow down obligations, right? All of those continue to evolve and change. So organizations are taking a much closer look at who they partner with, where those suppliers sit in the ecosystem, and where they can support both the mission and the compliance obligations that come with the work. So, as I said, everyone on the team needs to be a D1 athlete. And because the reality is that one weak link can create a risk for that entire program. So the firms that are winning understand this better than anyone else. So they know what it is.
It's not training day anymore. This is for mature organizations, and that was another common theme in the Clarity report. The haves and the have-nots kind of had another separate and breakdown. It's AI maturity due to governance. For that perspective, AI is one thing, but just readiness in general, whether it's cybersecurity, whether it's financial compliance reporting, all those things play into this. And I think, like you're alluding to, that's going to be not only a differentiator, but it's kind of a bit of a rarity, for as large as the defense industrial base is. This is the new thing.
This is the new thing, and a new normal, actually.
Yeah, the new norm. Yeah, it's the differentiator. So we need a strong team of solid athletes, right? That's step one out of the gate. So you mentioned DFARS and FAR requirements, and if there's somebody who stumbled around to this podcast and doesn't speak government speak with all the acronyms, we're talking about the Federal Acquisition Regulations, the basically Bible of government procurement with all the rules. And then the DFARS is the defense version of that, the supplement. And so with those tons of rules, and we won't get into the weeds of government contracting here, but there are lots of rules. And one of the big knocks on government contracting is the time it takes to go through the process with all these rules and all these compliance requirements and regimes. So one of the interesting features, especially after last year's big FAR overhaul and or revolutionary FAR overhaul, as it's called, FAR 2.0, meant to streamline things, make them quicker, and that's another feature of Golden Dome, the Shield. So great news, lots of money, no rules, right? So the OTAs and CSOs and all the alphabets, they get past all the rules, do what you want. We don't care. Here's the money, right?
I wish that was true, or I'm sure,
I'm sure they do too.
wish that was the case, but there is a misconception that OTAs and CSOs somehow allow contractors to avoid compliance requirements or that operational rigor. But that's not really the case, right?
Talk a little bit of OTAs and CSOs for the folks who are not as familiar with those, other than seemingly being a cheat code.
Yes.
What are those for? What are they used for?
So yes, so at a very high level, these are tools that the government uses to acquire capability more quickly, right? So they're designed to accelerate innovation, support prototyping because there's a lot going on, especially under the Golden Dome, and also bring in the non-traditional vendors into the defense ecosystem, right? A lot of players
The
out
ones that
there.
can't cite all the FAR rules, huh?
Exactly. Like that can be pretty intimidating for,
Yeah.
fairly new players, right? But they're also like, we don't neatly fit into this box. So how do I get to play in this field, right? And you're also seeing, interestingly, with this whole conversation on OTAs, is that we're seeing contractors respond to that, you know, favorably, right? So many organizations are now building new relationships. They're engaging earlier in this capture process. And they're looking for ways to participate in opportunities that may not follow that traditional acquisition path, right? But what I think, where people actually get confused is, they assume that the procurement process, because it's faster, the expectations are somehow lower. Newsflash, it's not, right? This is not a workaround. When anyone says OTAs or CSOs, no, it's not a workaround. They're just a faster way for the government to procure capability. In fact, one of the biggest mistakes I see organizations they make is they're focusing entirely on winning the prototype effort, but they're not spending enough time thinking about what comes next.
How do I do it?
I mean, yes. I mean, and if you're talking to, and if anyone in the audience, they're heavily into prototype, you eventually want to get to the next stage, right? You don't want that prototype to just die over there on that
One and
table,
done. Yeah, you actually want to make some
right?
money with it.
Exactly, right? So, yeah, and because the other thing is winning the OTA is not the hardest part. Again, let me just put it out there. You probably have, a good product. You're developing some really cool things. You can even win, under the OTA route. But the question is, can you scale? Like how many businesses actually ask those questions? Can you move from prototype to production? Can you scale quickly? Can you support the reporting, the compliance, the supply chain complexity, the operational requirements, the full laundry list, when it comes to participating in these larger programs? So do you have the systems in place that will take you to the next level? So that's why I think about OTAs and CSOs as an opportunity, but they're not an exemption. So let's be very clear about that. So they may accelerate procurement, but they don't eliminate accountability. So faster, as I said, faster procurement doesn't mean the accountability is lowered or reduced. So, and as organizations tend to be successful, they are the ones who actually understand the both sides of the equation very well, right? They know how to move quickly, but they've also built the operational foundation that's needed to execute once they win.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people were hoping that the old Outback slogan, "No rules, just right,"
Right.
kind of
Yeah.
applied here, but it doesn't sound like it. An
Yeah.
interesting clarity stat to drop here. Only
Yeah.
8% of respondents are actively pursuing OTAs. So it's an opportunity, but it's better to understand the real details there, really
Yeah.
for prototyping, for
Correct.
research, not you've been a government contractor forever and now just drop the rules. We got this new way for you to buy. Not
Right.
necessarily the
Yeah.
intent behind
Yeah.
those. So that's an important point. I think,
Hmm.
people didn't understand it's not just an endless money spigot now for anybody who wants to play. It's
Yeah.
just more opportunities for innovation, it sounds
Right.
like. But the
Yes.
challenge, as we
Yeah.
segue,
Yeah.
is let's say you're a new player into the field, and who wouldn't want to be a part of this?
Yeah.
Is how do I do it? Let's say I'm good enough to get an OTA, that my idea is great, but I got that burden of I haven't really done this at scale before, and the government is going to demand scale. So
Yeah.
winning the work is one problem. Being operationally built to execute it is
Yeah.
entirely different. So
Right.
Golden Dome seems to kind of stress test these handoffs in the life cycle. So a couple more clarity stats here. 90% of contractors experienced at least one declining metric in 2025. Okay, what does that mean? More than a quarter of projects ran over budget or behind schedule. Uh-oh, that's not going to work. So in a Golden Dome environment, those
Yeah.
aren't just performance problems, they're
Mhm.
disqualifiers. We talked about firms that maybe new to this or maybe good at it, whatever, if they've got the compliance things in place or if they've got the right philosophy. What separates the serious ones from the pretenders?
So this is actually since you plugged in clarity here. I just definitely want to say one thing here. It's one of my favorite sections of the full clarity study. For me, the value isn't really in the averages, right? I want to see what top performers are doing. I want to see what the winners are doing, right? And so I'm sure anyone who's tuning in, right? Because we spend a lot of time talking about what contractors should be doing, right? There's a lot of prescription out there. There's a lot of, notes and details and advice, all of that. But when you put the data together, and clarity does that, it gives us an opportunity to look at organizations that are consistently performing well. And the question logically follows is, what are they doing differently? And what's interesting is that it's not usually what people think it is. It's not that they have different challenges or they have it easy, right? Or it's not that they're operating in a different market. No, the challenges are not different. Their operating model is very different. They think very differently. And when I look across the data, I see a consistent pattern, right? The top performers tend to have better integration between functions. They work as a team, right? They work as this one integrated unit. They have better visibility into what's happening across the business. They have more confidence in areas like pricing, estimating, contract management. Like they have mastered all of that, right? And their compliance posture is as strong as it can be. And they tend to make decisions from a position of data and not from a position of reaction. Like it's not a gut instinct. Sure, we're all humans. We trust our gut. We follow that. But when it comes to hard business decisions, they look at data and they are confident about what they're seeing, right? It's not like some, an Excel spreadsheet showing you a report that's slapped on together. No, this is meticulously put together information that is coming off a very strong data architecture, right? And to me, that's what really separates them. They're not managing pricing in one system or quality or manufacturing in another system. They're running the business as one connected enterprise. And I think it's becoming even more important as organizations start introducing AI into their workflows, right? Because these days, no conversation is complete without AI, right? I think, Michael, I think CMMC is not going to be the big elephant in the room anymore. Maybe it's going to
Maybe there's
become
some space for AI in there. We'll see.
right. And the question isn't whether you're using AI. The question is whether you can govern it, right? You can control it, and whether and you can trust it, and how you can explain it, right? And because eventually somebody is going to, and somebody will. There's one thing in government contracting we can all agree on. If there's one thing that's guaranteed, it's an audit, right? So you will be asked the question, show me how you did this. Show me how you built the estimate. Show me how you arrived at this decision. Show me how you validated this AI generated output, right? The organizations that consistently perform well can answer those questions easily. And why? Because they have built those controls in the way they operate. So the best firms don't reconstruct evidence. They have worked this through, right? They generate it as part of their workflow. And the other thing is when somebody says, show me how you did this, guess what? That audit is not an event for them. For them, it's just another way to validate that, hey, I know this. You're just coming here to, this is just confirming what I already know. So that's operating from a position of strength and knowledge, right? So, and that's why I like these top performers benchmarks, because it really tells you that they operate differently, they think differently, they have the systems in place that gives them that enterprise-wide visibility. So it's about building a model that consistently produces better outcomes. So that's what separates them.
That's what success looks like. So on
Yeah.
the contrast, what do they consistently underestimate, do you think, when it comes to preparation and execution?
Yeah, great question. And it's perfectly, like juxtaposing the good versus the not so good, right? So the biggest things contractors underestimate is what it actually takes to execute successfully. Now, the interesting part is that it doesn't start after the award. It actually starts even before you submit a bid, because everybody focuses on the opportunity. That RFP dropped or the solicitation dropped. Everyone's focusing on the capture. Everyone's focusing on getting on the contract, right? But when you're building a bid, you're already making assumptions about staffing, about suppliers, compliance, reporting, costs, risk, schedule. the whole laundry list, right? But if you don't understand what it actually is going to take you to execute the work, it's very difficult to build an accurate estimate, right? It's very difficult to put together a realistic schedule or a plan that's achievable, right? So all of this has to happen before you even like play or, attempt to play, right? And that's where I think organizations get surprised. It's usually not because they can't do the technical work. A lot of our contractors out in the field are amazing. They're really good at what they do. But they start underestimating things that needs to happen like before you even click that submit button to submit your work. So, and that list includes, as I said, managing suppliers, tracking requirements, documenting things, right? So organizations don't get into trouble because they can't do the work. They get into trouble because they underestimated what it would take to deliver the work successfully, right? So, and again, when I say this, don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about just paperwork, right? It's not that. They're actual operational requirements.
There's probably reports and stuff that have to be filed. So, with that in mind, perfect segue
Yeah.
into the next question here. What does failure look like, right? And we know the risks, we know what the profile we want, we
Yeah.
know the compliance requirements, do
Yeah.
or die. Where does it break down?
So when people think about execution failure, they often think about missed deadlines or a cost overrun or compliance finding or supplier problems. And they view it as separate events. I don't. I look at them usually having the same root cause, right? Organizations are operating, with disconnected systems, your decision making is fragmented, and you're not getting the full picture. Let me help you visualize this with an example. So let's take a look at a manufacturing example, right? So let's say a supplier ships a defective part, right? And quality has identified the problem, but that information doesn't flow quickly enough internally to the manufacturing team. And manufacturing continues to build, the work continues, the inventory gets consumed, schedule moves forward. Nobody yet has flagged anything, right? And by the time the issue surfaces, it's no longer a quality problem anymore, right? It's no longer a cost problem even. It's actually a customer problem because now the customer is starting to ask you uncomfortable questions, right? So it's usually not this one catastrophic event that happens right away. No, it is a bunch of disconnects that compounds over time. So that's why I always say quality is not just quality. Supply chain is not just supply chain. Everything is connected. So again, I'll repeat what I said before. Organizations that perform well, they have visibility across all these different functions that I just mentioned, because of that one defect, right? Because you don't want the problem to reach the customer. You want to contain it. And that's what failure is, right? You're not able to contain the problem early on. Forget contain. You're not even able to identify it, right? So that's why visibility and integration is such an important part of this discussion. And just to quickly tie it to what you mentioned before, like the top performers, guess what? Your top performers have actually either perfected or almost perfected this whole concept of integration and connected enterprise.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think that has affected somebody who's listening to this along the way. And
Yeah.
before you have to learn the lesson at a gigantic scale,
Yeah.
where reputation comes into play, future business comes into play, we've got to focus on those fundamentals first. So kind of wrapping this all up, bringing it to a head, ask you a question that maybe a lot of people have on their minds right now. And that is, you're sitting across from a senior leader at a defense contracting agency right now. Tell them the one thing their organization needs to succeed in this environment.
So if I would have to give one recommendation, it would be take a hard look at your business before the market does it for you. You want to be in control of your business and your organization. You don't want market forces or the market dictating which direction your business should go, right? And you as the business leader, right, you usually know more than what you think you do, right? So if you're seeing same audit findings, if you're seeing problems that are happening, it's recurring, right? Just don't look at them as problems. They are signals, right? It's telling you what how, and it's basically like, what is this telling us about the business and how, it's operating, right? Look at that signal from that lens. What are the gaps? What's missing? Our leadership priorities really aligned with the outcomes you're trying to achieve, right? So where the gaps are. What you need to do, which is the harder part, is being honest about them and acting on them. So Golden Dome program actually does one good thing. It doesn't create weaknesses, it actually exposes them, which actually drives people to do something about it, right? The landscape is ripe, it's rich, there's lots going on here. And if you are serious about, really being part of this ginormous program, then guess what? Look at where the gaps are today, and you start from there. Actually, Michael, what would you tell leaders? It's a great question, though. So I'm going to pass it back to you.
Point the spotlight back at me. No, I love your point and I love this discussion. And I think this is hopefully going to be really helpful for people. But, in my lane of the world where I see things, especially when it comes to technology and protecting data, is treat compliance as a capability, not a cost center. There's tons of data to back this up, whether it's CMMC or whether it's some other cybersecurity requirement, or if it's just protecting your own intellectual property, your IP. You've got a gold mine. That is the value of your business. So, and the ones that get that, I think are going to be not only well positioned for this opportunity, but that's where the puck's going, as they say. The gap between firms that are doing this and not doing this is widening. Yeah, there is a cost to it. There is, some call it a pay for play, in programs like CMMC and such. But the investment in technology, data security, and all those things is not going away. Just like quality is extremely important. Once you get your operation to the point where it's humming and you can do what you need to do, you got to protect it. And that's why I'm always focused on protecting the data. You got to have a good moat and a good drawbridge to protect the data that's behind your castle. And with that, I am going to thank Padma for her time in chatting with us today. It was awesome. Love working with Padma. She is truly an expert. We have more content coming on Golden Dome, so keep an eye out for that. And finally, we actually have a Golden Dome readiness checklist. It's really cool. But basically, that's a readiness checklist for contractors who have been named to the SHIELD contract vehicle, and it focuses on processes, infrastructure, and things like that they need to have in place. Everything that we've been talking about today, but in a fancy checklist format. So definitely check that out. Find out if you're well prepared, where your gaps exist, and what to prioritize when it comes to Golden Dome. Because I think as Padma alluded to, and we've been talking about, this is the future, right? This is, what's happening right now is what we've talked about. This is not going to change. This is how purchasing is going to go forward. And so if you enjoyed this, like I said, we've got much more out there for you. And again, want to thank Padma for her time. And thank you for being here and listening. And look forward to seeing you on a future podcast. Thanks so much.